Hey there, Dr. Daniel Chong, vital-human.com. There seems to be a little bit of confusion out there among some people about what's the best way to look at your arteries to actually determine whether or not there's plaque in them and better understand your risk. I always tell people that if you do a risk calculator, you take your history, you look at blood work, you look at your family history, blood pressure, etc., you end up with a better and better educated guess the more information you look at. But technically it's still an educated guess. And so imaging can be helpful in the sense that it helps provide a more of a bottom line understanding as to what's actually playing out in your artery linings based on whatever else you know about yourself. So it's an important thing to do, in my opinion, for most people at some stage in their lives. I'll mention some ages later. But basically there's kind of two primary ways of screening yourself using imaging. One is called a coronary artery calcium score, which is a CT scan of the arteries around your heart, and the other is a carotid artery CIMT ultrasound, which is a detailed ultrasound looking at the carotid arteries in your neck as they move up towards your brain. They both have strengths and weaknesses. There's no definitive optimal perfect way of actually looking at your arteries, but they're kind of the best we have, especially in the realm of screening for the average person. The most important thing to remember about calcium scores is that they do not detect all forms of plaque. They only detect plaque in your artery linings that have calcified, which is technically a later stage of plaque. And so basically when you get the test done, it gives you a score as to whether or not you have any calcified plaque detected. The higher the score, the more calcified plaque is in there. But if you get a 0 score, that does not mean you don't have any plaque in your arteries. It only means for sure that you don't have any detectable calcified plaque. Unfortunately, it is true that in some, not super common, but potentially, some potential cases, you can have a situation where the person has no detected calcified plaque, but they do have a significant amount of non-calcified or soft plaque, which is technically the type that we would be more concerned about because it has a higher potential for rupturing and causing a clot to form, etc. So the main take-home message I tell people is that if you get a calcium score and you get a 0, do not assume you have no plaque at all. Just assume that the likelihood of a high amount is pretty low. And depending on your age, a 0 technically means more and more to us. So point being, the older you are and you still get a 0, the more and more trustworthy that is that you're having likely very little plaque developing in your artery linings. Whereas if you're younger and you get a calcium score done, the odds of you having calcified plaque in your arteries is pretty low anyways, so getting a 0 is not really telling you much of anything. So hopefully that part makes sense. The value of carotid artery CIMT ultrasound testing is that it detects all stages of plaque. It detects tiny little plaques that have not calcified at all, little soft plaques that are just starting to form in certain spots. So it's a much more sensitive test for picking up on plaque. The only downside to that test is that it's looking at the arteries in your neck, which are admittedly a pretty common place for plaque to form, but they are technically not looking at the arteries around your heart. And occasionally, I've literally looked at over 1,000 of those in my career, and occasionally we will have people who have actually very little to no plaque in the carotid arteries, but actually a significant amount of plaque in their coronary arteries. So I don't completely rule out the possibility that people can have higher amounts of plaque around their heart if they have a low calcium score, but it's still a better way to look at things than nothing, for sure. And there's pretty good research to support the predictive value that these carotid artery CIMT ultrasounds have for predicting heart attacks and stroke risk. Lastly, I just want to mention there is another type of imaging study that I will utilize with people in certain circumstances called a Clearly analysis, C-L-E-E-R-L-Y. That is an AI-generated evaluation of images that are created by a patient getting what's called a coronary CT angiography. That is a different type of CT scan than a calcium score, in the sense that the person first receives a contrast dye that's injected, and then they get the CT scan that's a lot more sort of detailed in what it's looking at, and the dye allows the dye allows for a better evaluation of actual soft and calcified plaque, so it can delineate between the two, unlike a calcium score. And then a Clearly analysis is again an AI generated evaluation of the images that you get when you get a CT angiography, and it provides more detail than you're able to get from just the standard CT angiography study. So I will use that with some people in certain circumstances, but I don't typically recommend it as a screening study for various reasons. The higher amount of radiation, much more expensive, and you typically are going to want to get insurance coverage, so a doctor to order, etc., etc. So I think that's all for now. Hopefully that's a helpful thing. Again, my bottom line is I consider imaging studies to be a crucial aspect of being more thorough and doing a better evaluation of risk with people than just history taking, physical exam, blood work, all of which are good. They just don't quite provide the same amount of evidence as to whether or not there's any plaque in there. And then lastly, I'll just say, typically in my practice, my age cutoffs for calcium scores, I will usually not recommend a calcium score to men under 50 or women under 55 or 60. It's just very, very unusual to have a score come back above 0. The one time I will recommend that is if they do have a family history of early onset cardiovascular disease, in which case it may be worth it. But I will frequently recommend carotid ultrasounds, like the CIMT carotid ultrasounds, to people much younger. I would go down as low as 20 to 30 years old, depending on family history. So that's my take on that. Hope that was helpful. Vital-human.com. Daniel Chong. See you next time. Thanks.